Fate did not even spare those who are cursed with channeling its predictions. Now, as we reach the witching hour itself, it is time for our third and final speaker of the evening. Thana, the cards, please.
There is only one card.
One card. Ah, I thought he might turn up eventually. For, ladies and gentlemen, the teller of our final tale this evening is Death himself. Death has many tales to tell. Death is behind all of us. But tonight, ladies and gentlemen, as the iron tongue of midnight strikes, Death is behind all of you. And tonight, Death is going to tell you a very singular tale, using the mouth of the puppet he has employed for many years for this purpose. And so I would ask now if Death would come forward. Death, the stage is all yours.
We'll visit you all in time. And those who do not switch off their mobile phones sooner than done. Can you all hear me? Now, soon you shall. Well, here's a tale to lighten the mood, as my stories tend to do. Reading the signs, it is called. When Vernon came to a roundabout with no diversion sign, he saw he'd gone wrong. He lowered his window in the hope of hearing where the motorway was, but the night was as silent as the February sky. It looked close to sagging onto the roofs of all 5 streets. He drove back to the last sign, which stood on another roundabout, and then he noticed what he'd previously overlooked. The 4 metal legs supporting the sign had gouged erratic tracks through the dewy grass. Plainly someone thought it would be fun to move the sign. 5 roads met at this intersection too. Vernon had been driving for at least 10 minutes through the moorland town, and surely he ought to be close to the route back to the motorway. He might have phoned Emma to say he was delayed, except that she was generally asleep by midnight. He hoped she was now. Instead he turned along the road between the pair he'd already followed. If it didn't bring him to a sign, he would come back. The terraced streets were deserted. The low sky appeared to have squashed every colour besides grey out of the ranks of narrow houses. The wan glow of the street lamps blackened the window frames and the curtains that blinded the panes. The front doors that opened onto the street. He glimpsed movement among the vehicles parked half off the pavement, but it was only a cloud of fumes seeping from under the hood of a car. Beyond the car, the road bent sharply. When it straightened, he saw somebody trudging ahead. Even from several hundred yards away, Vernon saw the walker was unusually tall. As he put on speed for fear that the man might turn aside before Vernon could ask for directions, he became aware that the fellow's head was disconcertingly small. He turned to peer towards the car, and the upper portion of his body slipped askew. The light of the next street lamp found it as it righted itself, and Vernon realised that a child was perched on the man's shoulders. He was relieved to see it, but unnerved to have imagined anything else. He could only hope that he was safe to drive, and he wasn't too much in need of sleep. The boy had regained his hold on the man's shoulders by the time Vernon drew alongside. The small face looked scrubbed, shiny, gleaming under the street lamp, and the wide eyes were alert despite the hour. His long nose twitched, perhaps with nerves, as his lips pinched inwards. The father's long face had been dragged thinner by the weight of his jowls, and his dull, tired eyes were underscored by skin that looked bruised, while his loose lips drooped under a bulbous nose. In his indeterminately coloured suit, with his shirt collar open, he scarcely seemed dressed for the night. And the boy's outfit wasn't much more suitable, a waspishly striped jumper inside a dark overall, both of them a size too large. Vernon lowered the passenger window and shivered at the chill that met him. "Will this bring me back to the motorway?" he called. The man sidled between two parked cars and stooped to the window. Wouldn't speak until he lowered himself over to his knees, as if his burden had brought him to them. Vernon let the boy's hands thump the roof, presumably for support. The man's breath glimmered in the wintry air as he said, "What are you asking for?" "I'm looking for the motorway. I was wondering if I'd gone wrong." If the man seemed unhappy with this, perhaps that was his habitual condition. The flatness of his voice would be a local trait. As the boy's hand clutched at his shoulders, he gave the road ahead a dull glance. "You're no more wrong than me." "We were going that way, weren't we?" The boy's voice was shrill and rendered tinny by the roof. "You have to say," he said. The skin beneath the man's eyes twitched as his lips chafed each other. As he was embarrassed to be prompted to hitch. "Look for a lift by all means," Vernon said, and when the fellow's face grew blanker still, "I mean with me." The boy kicked up his legs, displaying trainers that reminded Vernon how much Tom's used to cost. As the cuffs of the overalls flapped, they revealed the boy wasn't wearing socks. "I'll give you a ride, son," Vernon called, and tell the man, "You don't want him out like that at this time of night in this weather." Even if this was presumptuous, he thought it needed to be said. The man's face stayed expressionless as the boy leapt down from his shoulders like an acrobat. The trainers struck the pavement with a plump thud that set a dog barking in a house, and the boy released one of the man's house. "Where are you going?" the man said. Did you think the boy was about to run off? The man straightened up, and Vernon couldn't see his face. Perhaps Vernon had misunderstood the question, as the man added, "You can't stay sat on me." The boy's thin lips sucked inwards, losing any colour, as if his teeth or something else had pained him. "Would you like to sit in front?" Vernon said. The man ducked to stare at him. "We'll be turning the other way." "I expect you should." Vernon leaned over to tip the passenger seat forward. "You do as your dad says," he said. "Better sit in the back." As the boy clambered in, he gave Vernon quite a look. Vernon remembered earning glares whenever he told Tom not to do something at that age. When he pushed the seat upright, the boy made a face, though in the dimness Vernon couldn't see what kind. Once the man had slumped onto the seat and fumbled the safety belt into its socket, Vernon said, "Straight on?" "That's where." The man seemed to resent having to say so, knowing that he was as weary as he looked. As he shut the window, Vernon sent the car forward. Talking wanted to help him stay wakeful, and he said, "What's kept you both out so late?" The man's breath clouded the air as he muttered, "Broke down." "Was that your car I saw back there?" "No idea what you've seen." Perhaps the boy would be better company. As Vernon glanced at the small, indistinct face, he saw the empty fleet fleeing backwards. "Have you been somewhere good?" "Playing." Vernon took that as an affirmative. He tried giving the man the kind of look adults shared on the subject of children, but the fellow was staring dully through the windscreen. It was hardly polite to seem amused by how the boy took after him, and Vernon stayed quiet until the street ended at a junction. "Left?" he suggested. "That's us," the man just about said. From previous journeys, Vernon had a sense that the motorway curved in this direction several miles ahead. The road he turned along was wider than the one he left, but no less deserted. Cars occupied the concrete drives of houses frozen by the frigid light. He saw the boy's eyes flickering from side to side as though to take everything in, which prompted him to say, "I bet my son would have thought this was an adventure at your age." A shadow fluttered over the boy's face as he peered out the window, out of the mirror, I beg your pardon. How old's that? You tell him, the man said. Vernon thought he was addressing the boy, then wondered if he was. 8, Vernon said, which was apparently an insult, given how blank the small phrase grew. His name's Tom, Vernon said, in an attempt to placate him. What's yours? Tell him in your name, son. I'm me. I'm sure you are, nobody else. Vernon made another bid to show the adult viewpoint, but the man was giving his thoughts to himself. I'm Jack, Vernon said. Neither of his passengers responded with a name, though the man uttered a breath that bloomed grey. Vernon thumbed the button on his side of the car to ensure the passenger window was shut and turned the heating up to full. The man's gaze had begun to dodge back and forth as though he was imitating his son, and his thick tongue poked his lips apart. Time to play, he said. The boy sat forward. Try telling, Pop, he said, and grinned as if he was no less proud of his teeth than of the answer. Sit back, son, Vernon told him. You need to put your belt on. As the boy's face withdrew into the dimness, his grin was the first thing to vanish. That's no fun. I can't drive unless everyone is strapped in. I don't want the police telling me I can't, do I? You don't. Perhaps the man's voice was so toneless because he didn't like to see his son rebuked, in which case he should have done the parental job, though Vernon felt guilty about neglecting to check the boy had used the belt. He braked and waited for the boy to yank it across himself like a mime of resentment. As the car gained speed, he said, Time to play what? The man's eyes flickered, but not in his direction. You'll see. If it's a secret, just say so. Don't be like that. The fellow actually think Vernon was being unreasonable. Before Vernon could make his feelings even plainer, the man turned his head away from him. See the signs, he mumbled. Vernon saw the small head swing that way too. So that's safe, the boy said. In a moment Vernon thought he understood, but said only, Intelligent chap, isn't he? The man expelled another ashen breath. Likes to think so. Did he resent his own son's intellect? That might explain why the boy seemed somehow to be holding back. But Vernon wasn't about to be daunted and showing concern. Are you cold there in the back? He said. I've a blanket in the boot if you'd like to wrap up. Last thing he wants, the man declared. It really won't be any trouble. You're right, it won't. Vernon was ready to ignore it, not to argue with the man, until the boy spoke up, shriller than ever. I'm how I like. If you say so, Vernon said, but felt inadequate. If there's anything else I can do, just let me know. No call for that. The man nodded at the windscreen as though to indicate he was leaving the subject behind. I'm miserable tired, he said. The boy was where the man had looked. It's my turn. I believe I see what you're up to, Vernon said. Is that a fact? It sounded like a question the man lacked the energy to raise. Can anybody play? Vernon said. Depends. Even less encouraging, the man added. Depends what you reckon the game is. I'll make tea. As the man gave him a look that must have been convicting with feeble-mindedness, Vernon found the next number plate ahead. Owl's own banks, he suggested. You're as clever as him. This didn't much resemble praise, but the man contributed our own business. Out of bounds, the boy said. Vernon felt oddly relieved to have identified the game, as if he'd recovered some kind of control. Do you play it whenever you're on the road? He asked the man. Got to keep your brain going somehow. So you don't nod off at the wheel, you mean? When the fellow kept any response to himself, Vernon found inspiration in the next number plate. Weariness is fiendish. The man thumped his forehead with his fingertips in one hand, as though to enliven his mind. What it's for? The boy seemed to need no time to ponder. What I found. Was the man scowling at his quickness? Perhaps it was up to Vernon to carry on the game, and a registration number let him say, "Gee up, trigger!" The boy's giggle was even higher than his voice. His father glowered at him, unless he was making sure his turn came next. He looked away from the mirror before he said, "Get us thinking." "Gone up there," the boy said at once. Vernon had the odd notion that the game had turned into a dialogue from which he was excluded. He was glad to see they had reached the edge of town. The houses ended several yards ahead, and beyond them the road stretched into empty darkness. "Where shall I drop you?" he said. The man shook his head as if to round himself or to dislodge some unwelcome burden. "Not round here. I thought you said you were on my way." "Never said different. Not yet, that's all." Vernon almost laughed aloud at the man's brusqueness, since there seemed to be no other way to take it. "So long as you let me know when you're where you want to be," he said, as the last of the light slipped from the boy's face in the mirror. The street lamps receded while the moor loomed around the car. The long, low slopes were in no hurry to reveal themselves, and even once they gained some definition, the ragged crests were scarcely distinguishable from the drooping sky. Although they hit the motorway, the strip of illuminated road that ran between the sprawling verges led in the direction where Vernon assumed it to be. Otherwise, the headlamp beams only blurred the dark that hunched around and ahead of the species of road. He needed more than not of his sight to keep him vigilant, and he tried saying, "So, what do you do, Mr. Mr. is right." Just dully, the man added, "You've seen." "That's what we get for being fathers, isn't it?" When his bid for good humour fell short of the man, Vernon said, "I was thinking of the other kind of job." "After one of them, are you?" Even by the man's standards, the retort seemed unnecessarily harsh, and then Vernon wondered if he was unemployed. "Isn't there much work hereabouts?" "Here?" The man waved a hand so sluggishly that it looked hampered by the darkness. "See if you can think." Vernon might have counted that the man didn't seem especially capable of it. Instead, he concentrated on the lit stretch of road that veered from side to side. The protracted curve that led so far out of the way he thought he should be taking, that he let out a dimly luminous breath when another elongated bend corrected the deviation. All this made him say, "Don't you mind leaving your car all that way back?" "Doesn't matter what I mind. Couldn't you call someone?" Presumably he didn't belong to a motoring organisation, and local garages would have shut down hours ago. Vernon was aware of talking for the sake of it, and he said, "I wouldn't like to break down out here and not be able to get help." "Better hadn't, then." "No, I mean, if I did, I'd be able to call." "Not here, you'd not. No thing gets out," the man said with morose triumph. "I think my phone would. It's pretty well up to date, not like its owner." Vernon slowed the car to a walking pace and found his mobile in the fat pocket of his padded coat. As he touched the illuminated screen, he glimpsed the boy's face blanching in the mirror. "Expect you've never seen the like, son," the man muttered. Vernon blinked at the phone and brought it closer to his face before pocketing it. "I'm afraid your dad is right, I can't pick anything up." "Want to watch out what you're picking," the man said, so indistinctly that he might almost have been talking in his sleep. "He's right again, son," Vernon said, the only way he could make sense of the remark. "Be careful." The boy lurched forward, not far enough for the dashboard light to illuminate his face. "What about?" "Who you get involved with," Vernon said, and glanced at the man for agreement. When the fellow kept his gaze on the dark, Vernon added, "What they're up to, as well." The boy fell back, as if the belt recaptured him. If his father had glanced at him in the mirror, the man's expression was too fleeting for Vernon to catch. As the car put on speed once more, the grass and weeds that framed the headlight beams twitched to greet them. The dim outlines of the slopes shifted as the wind rattled the passenger window, emphasising the chill. "Would you really have walked all the way up here?" Vernon said. The man shrugged as if trying to work off the last traces of his burden. "No choice." "Well, I think we always have those. It's up to us to decide what's best to do." This was aimed at the boy, even if Vernon couldn't have explained precisely why. It was the kind of thing he still said to Tom. But the man mumbled, "Try saying that round here." Vernon might have pointed out that he just had. He assumed the man was referring to the kind of life he had to lead, the poverty he believed he'd made plain. He was relieved to see a pair of headlamp beams sprout above a slope against the sky ahead. At least the number plate would provide a distraction. The beams groped back and forth as if they were reaching vainly for the lightless clouds, and then they fell to the road as the car appeared round a bend. Vernon sensed his passengers readying themselves, but it seemed he was the first to read the plate. "3 nice eggs," he said. He heard the man part his sticky lips, but the boy was faster. "That's not easy." "There's no escape," the man said, and stared at the mirror. The other car sped past, and the boy's face went out like a dead bulb. It was dimly silhouetted by a pair of red lights which shrank to embers before the darkness doused them. Vernon was realising how devious a route the other vehicle had followed. "This can't be the only road, can it?" he said. "It's that all right," the man said, without looking away from the mirror. "You'll see." In that case, it must be the diversion, and Vernon had to admit he wouldn't be unhappy to leave his passengers along the way, because of the tension it had brought with them. It and the chill were afflicting with shivers. He was tempted to offer the blanket again. Perhaps the boy was inured to the local weather, and as the headlights revealed yet another extended bend, Vernon said, "Are there still schools round here, then?" "Still." The man might have been naming the words as reflected in the mirror. "I was wondering where he goes to school," Vernon said. "Try asking." Though this sounded quite unlike an invitation, Vernon said, "Where do you, son?" As the boy inched forward, the man demanded, "Who's saying he does?" Improbable as it seemed, could the boy have been taught at home? At least that might explain the man's resentment. "I'm saying he seems educated," Vernon said, "literate for his age." "He's good at that. Good at a lot else as well." This seemed more discontented than Vernon understood. How could anyone declare their own child's intelligence? He was determined to involve the boy now, and as the road straightened out further than the headlight beams could reach, he said, "What should I be looking for, son?" "Don't know." "What sign, I mean?" "Sign." Was the boy imitating his father to placate him? "For your village, if that's what it is," Vernon said. "There's none." Vernon wished he could make out the boy's face. Might the child be afraid to display too much intelligence around his father? "Your house, then," Vernon said. "Can't see." Perhaps he was protesting by having to sit at the back, and yet Vernon wondered if he misunderstood. "Will I know when I come to it?" "You'll be put right," the man said. He sounded weary of the conversation and not resolved to end it. Vernon wasn't going to be silenced, and not just because chatting would help him to stay awake. "I'm guessing you're a reader, son?" "Reader? Of books, yes. Is that where you picked up some of your way with words?" "Here's where." If he was trying to sound like his father, it didn't quite come off. The uninhabited night all around them didn't lend his answer much credibility. "I'm asking because I travel in books," Vernon said, as much to the man as to the child. "Thought you were travelling in a car." Vernon couldn't judge from the boy's shrill tone whether this was a joke, and the man's dull face gave no assistance. "The publisher sent me around to show the shops the books. Vernon said doggedly. A few of us still do that, even with all the modern developments. The boy leaned forward far enough that Vernon saw his indistinct face was blank. Surely no child could be unaware of computers and the internet and how they'd changed the world. Perhaps having grown up with it, the boy simply took it all for granted. "I have some books in the boot you might like," Vernon said, "the kind my son used to." "We'll want none of them," the man said so fiercely that his breath glimmered with each word. "Nobody's getting out." "I didn't mean up here, hardly the right place." "Right for some things." Vernon wasn't about to inquire which. For several reasons, he welcomed the sight of headlamp beams ahead. They ranged about beneath the clouds until the night appeared to cut them down, and he felt as if more than the dark and the huge smudges of moorland had closed in. Only the moor had obscured the beams, and so they were branched above a lower slope. As the lorry swung into view around a bend, he grew tense, surely just anticipating the game. The headlight beams dropped to the tarmac as his did, and he squinted at the registration number. "Call General Assembly," he said. "Child goes a-roving." Vernon was reflecting that the boy had proved his point about literacy when the man said, "Can't get away." The lorry roared past, and Vernon glanced at the mirror. And just the headlamps turned the boy's face so white. As the rear lights shrank into the darkness, the boy sank back, as though he wanted to emulate them. Vernon didn't like to think the child could be so afraid of his father, and then a worse notion came to him. He could only drive while he struggled to think. His mind felt frozen by the chill and weighed down by the dark, as if he might be able to use it as he left the desolate emptiness behind. A wind blundered against the car and set the passenger window jittering, and he found he didn't want to look towards the man beside him. The dim slopes of the moor were trembling, and he wondered if the boy was fighting to restrain a shiver, just as Vernon was. He did his best to peer into the mirror without betraying that he was, but the boy's face had retreated into indistinctness. He was trying to discern its expression when he glimpsed a light ahead, and then another, and a third, in a regular series of them, following a line beyond a gap between the slopes. He didn't dare to hope too much until the car was nearly at the gap, through which he saw more lights speeding both ways on a straight road close to the uneven horizon. They were on the motorway, and the intervening land was almost flat. He took a breath and swallowed, and then he had to speak. I don't think I'm seeing a house." The man stared ahead. "Keep looking." "What am I likely to see?" The man seemed no more eager to respond than Vernon had been to ask. It was the boy who said, "Nothing you'd call one." What was he trying to convey? Even by narrowing his eyes, Vernon still couldn't see the boy's face. He might have thought the child was trying to stay out of reach of the man's gaze. Before Vernon could think of a comment to risk, the man muttered, "You'll have us for a way yet." Vernon saw the miles of deserted moorland he had yet to cross, and the lights shuttling along the motorway as if to remind him how distant they were. And then he saw another light, a dim but undeniable glow on the clouds beyond the spot where the motorway disappeared rightwards over the horizon. It was sure the glow denoted a service area, and it prompted him to say, "I could take you to the services, and then you're on your own." He sensed unease so palpable it sent a shiver through him. The man raised his sluggish head as he was confronting the mirror. "Depends what happens on the way," he said. Too late, Vernon realised he shouldn't have spoken. His first mistake had been to bring his passengers up here, where nobody else could see them. Now he would have been taking them among other people, but what chance had he left himself? Why did it take so long to grasp how little the man knew about the child he pretended was his son? Not his name, or his age, or where he lived and went to school. No wonder he hadn't owned up to a name either, although perhaps that gave Vernon some faint hope, since it suggested that the man might be him, capable of talking. Then the hope went out as the darkness had seized it, and the car seemed to grow cold as the depths of a cave. The man had withheld his name before Vernon's phone had turned out not to work. He was overtaken by a shiver, so convulsive, as his foot slipped off the accelerator. The car lost speed at once, and the man's head sprung towards him. "What are you trying to do?" "I'm not trying anything," Vernon protested, and instantly knew what he should. Using just his toes, while he dug his heel into the rubber mat on the floor of the car, he pressed the pedal down. He let the car surge forward and then lifted his foot with the accelerator. His ankle and his shin ached from the strain, but his leg hadn't moved, and surely the man couldn't see what Vernon was doing. The head at the edge of his vision loomed towards him once more, and he didn't dare to meet the fellow's eyes. "What's happened now?" the man demanded. "I don't know, I'm not sure." Vernon managed not to grit his teeth at the pain in his leg before he'd finished speaking. He waited for the speed to drop so far that the car began to judder, and then he went down a gear and another. He inched his foot higher, slowing the car enough to turn it shaky again. Before he could speak, he had to swallow a cry at the dull agony in his leg. Something wrong with the engine. I don't know the first thing about them, do you?" He hadn't said half of that when he realised how useless his plan was. If the man was able to fix cars, he would have fixed his own. The pain made his foot lurch off the accelerator, and the car wavered to a halt and stalled. The man was staring at him, but it took Vernon some seconds to turn his head. The man's eyes were so dull that his emotions were unreadable even when he spoke. "I'll give it a look. I'll need to open the bonnet." The man's sagging face came so close that his greyish breath settled on Vernon's skin. "How'll you do that?" "I'm doing it now," Vernon said, and leaned towards the floor in front of his seat. It's done." He was unable to breathe until the man sprung the buckle of the belt out of its socket and scrabbled at the handle to open the door and cycled with a crouch onto the road. The fellow twisted around that position and stared into the car. "Shut the door for heaven's sake," Vernon said. "It's cold enough in here." The man slammed the door hard enough to shake the car. Vernon had been afraid he would demur. As the man tramped into the headlight beams, Vernon said low but urgently, "Is your dad?" "He's not my dad." That was all the confirmation Vernon needed, and he blurted, "What can you tell me about him?" The boy leaned forward as the man stooped to the bonnet, and Vernon saw the child's face was pale as ice. "Never mind," Vernon remembered. "You're safe now. Where do you want me to take you?" "Over there," the boy said, and pointed beyond the man who was attempting to lift the bonnet that Vernon hadn't actually released. "Past all the lights." Vernon was distressed to think the child might be almost too scared to breathe, so that his breaths weren't visible. "The far side of the motorway, you mean?" "That's where he got me from." The man thrust his head towards the windscreen and thumped on the bonnet. "Can't get in!" "Stand back a moment, let me try the engine again." Vernon shouted before lowering his voice. "Sit back, son, hold on tight." As the man straightened up, the boy did the same. "Have you got your belt on?" Vernon was anxious to learn. "Never took it off." How had he managed to crane forward so far? Vernon hadn't time to think about it now. The glare of the headlight mounted the man's body as he retreated several steps, which left his face harder to read. "Stay there!" Vernon shouted, and twisted the key in the ignition. The starter motor rasped, and the engine emitted a shrill, stuttering cough, but that was all. he felt the key grow slippery with perspiration as his mouth grew dry as ash. He mustn't release the key yet. He could keep it turned for 10 seconds before he had to leave the engine dead for 30 more. And then the engine sputtered into life. He seized the gear lever and struggled to manipulate it into reverse, but it only jerked into the slot for 4th gear. The man was growing restless, swaying forward in the headlights, and Vernon realised he hadn't locked the passenger door in case the fellow heard. Even if he did, what could he do about it? Vernon thumbed the button, and the door locked with a loud click, just as the lever found reverse gear. The car lurched backwards with a squeal of the tyres, and as Vernon threw it into first gear to swerve around the man, the headlights illuminated the entire figure. His hands were jerking towards his face, and Vernon thought he was miming dismay until the man cupped them around his mouth to yell a solitary word. "Moonchild!" For a confused moment, Vernon thought the fellow was giving his name at last. The hands sank, and he saw the man's expression. If the long face had slumped even further, it was with relief. He looked as though he could scarcely believe his own good luck. Perhaps that was what seized Vernon as an icy chill, unless it was the sight of his small passenger escaping the restraint of the safety belt with a sinuous reptilian motion, or even just the way the temperature dropped with the cavernous iciness the boy brought with him. His neck was only up to its length, as his head swayed toward the man, who retreated to the verge of the road and was thrusting out his hands to fend off whatever he saw. "He's yours now!" he yelled. "You chose him! You're welcome to him!" He sounded hysterical with delight, and perhaps this was too much for Vernon's passenger. Before Vernon could flinch, the boy scrambled over the back of the empty seat and slithered, head down, to unlock the door. He darted out of the car on all fours and leapt to his feet with a cry that sounded less like a child than a night bird. All the same, it was a word. "Carry!" he was demanding. Vernon had a last glimpse of his face, which was white as the underside of a slug. The eyes dwindled as the mouth gaped with a grin that reached around the sides of the head. The man had staggered backwards as the door swung wide, and now he whirled around to dash along the road. He hadn't reached the limit of the headlights when the pursuer caught him. Clothes flapping like its elongated limbs, it sprang onto his shoulders and dug its fingers into the top of his head. Vernon didn't know if the shrill sound was a cry of triumph or the man's wail of despair, or both. He saw the man flee out of the headlamp beams as if he could somehow outdistance the burden on his back. Then the man stumbled off the road and rushed into the night as the rider kicked his chest to spur him onwards. It was a game, Vernon thought wildly, a childish game, if not a senile one. Quite some time after the figure pranced helplessly into the wilderness, Vernon managed to shut the passenger door and lock it, and eventually his shaking fingers let him control the car. He eased it forward and then drove as fast as he dared, because the lights on the motorway seemed as distant as stars. Until he reached them, if he ever did, he would be more aware of the darkness at his back.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank our guests this evening, Alison Littlewood and Death himself. And thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.